So welcome to this latest Nomura Weekly Economics podcast. My name's George Buckley, the Chief UK Economist at Nomura. On this week's podcast, we're going to focus on trade protectionism and China. It comes at a particularly crucial time with President Trump firmly embedded in the White House and in a week where he'll be meeting with China's President Xi Jinping in Florida. I'm delighted to be joined for today's podcast by our Chief Asia Economist, Rob Subbaraman, who will be talking about his latest detailed report, The Impact of US Trade Protectionism Centering on China. It's a weighty 33 pages of timely analysis, so for those listeners who haven't had a chance to read it yet, we hope this podcast will give you a good overview in just 10 minutes. Rob, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. What your article aims to do is to look at how Asian economies might be exposed to potential US protectionist measures against China, given each country's input into Chinese exports to the US. Perhaps you could start proceedings with you giving us a brief overview of your work and findings.
Sure, thanks, George. Pleasure to be on. So, we wanted to have a deep dive into trying to gauge the ultimate export exposure of Asia and looking at other countries as well to the US. And I think the key word's ultimate, because the tricky part in doing this type of analysis is that trade has become more and more value added. So you take a country like China or even Mexico, a lot of China's and Mexico's exports to the US aren't really China's or Mexico's. They're parts and components. A lot of the value added comes from other countries. Indeed, for Mexico, a lot of the Mexico's exports to the US actually have parts and components from US companies. So we wanted to essentially reclassify, if you like, the trade, the exports, by disentangling the foreign value added in specifically Mexico and China's gross exports, and reassigning it back to its original source countries. So we've done that, and we also look at the direct exports to the US of these countries. And I think importantly, we've scaled the ultimate exports by the source country's GDP, because that will give you a more meaningful metric of how important ultimate exports to the US are for these countries.
And which countries, Rob, do you think are going to be the most badly affected if the US does go down this protectionist route with A, China, B, Mexico?
Yeah, so it actually throws up some interesting results once you've put the value added of exports back to where it originally comes from. I guess the first interesting result is Mexico's ultimate exposure is no longer number one. It slides from the top spot to the number six most exposed. And China falls from 14th to 32nd out of our 38 countries that we do this for. So that's the first interesting thing. But to your question, George, of which countries are kind of ultimately most exposed to goods exports to the US, most exposed is a small one that people don't focus on, Vietnam. And it's not so much due to the value-added trade. It's more just Vietnam's direct exports to the US, scaled by its the size of those exports relative to its GDP, puts it very exposed. Makes up about 20% of its GDP, very high. And followed from Vietnam is Canada, and then Taiwan, Ireland, Malaysia, Mexico, Thailand, Singapore, Korea, Switzerland, Chile, Israel. The interesting thing I find with this work and the results is once you've reassigned the value added, you find really that a lot of China's exports to the US really contains value added from other Asian countries. And so once you've assigned it back, we find that in terms of ultimate exposure to the US, 6 of the top 10 most exposed countries are in Asia.
And I think one other thing, I mean, that's bad enough, but we haven't even taken consideration of the fact that China might retaliate in response to the US. And I think you mentioned this in the article, particularly noticing this investor survey. And what do you think that the likelihood of that happening would be?
Well, I mean that's it's certainly a risk. I think relative. So the interesting thing I find, George, is so far looking at what's happened so far in Trump's presidency, is he's basically he's renegotiating NAFTA. He's dropped the US out of TPP. But his kind of actions against China, Asia, have been conspicuously absent so far. And that's striking because really, the U.S. has a trade deficit with Mexico, sure, around $50-60 billion per year. Its trade deficit with China is more than 6 times that. So by far the bigger fish to fry, if the U.S. really wants to reduce its trade deficit, is really China. And China has a lot more room to retaliate than Mexico does. So that is, certainly I think a risk going forward is that you could see tit-for-tat retaliation, and then that could spill over into affecting several other countries. And as you say, George, we did do this investor survey. We've done it twice, and looking at the results on how would China most likely respond to trade protectionism, there's a very strong view by the investor survey we did for Europe investors and the one we did for Asian investors. It's both consistent that there would be a kind of retaliation by China, either targeting China purchases of either targeting things like iPhones, U.S. autos, Boeing aircrafts, or stepping up enforcement of anti-monopoly laws on American companies. They were 2 of the common ways of seeing retaliation. In terms of the chances of China doing nothing, it was regarded as low single digit.
And that brings me on to another issue, I guess, which is our FX team is bearish the dollar. I mean, the dollar's risen by about 1/3 since 2012, but then they're now bearish the dollar. And what is the possibility of, rather than this sort of tit-for-tat protectionism, wouldn't potentially a fall in the dollar be good for the US trade deficit? How much could the US trade deficit contract potentially because of a fall in the dollar, making the US more competitive?
It's hard to gauge, and I guess, George, a good example of this is the much speculated border adjustment tax that has been proposed, which would essentially be as much as a 20% tax on U.S. tariff on U.S. imports. I've seen, estimates that the dollar could essentially appreciate by 20% to actually depreciating. So I think it's very difficult to really come up with an estimate of what effect the trade protectionism would have on the dollar, partly because it's not just trade, it's capital flows. But I think, as Bilal has very well articulated, if there is protectionism and the U.S. is talking down the dollar at the same time, most likely the dollar would weaken. And I would say, in particular, given it's put it very simply, it's already strengthened substantially. So I think that's the right call, that the dollar would weaken. The one caveat I would have is I think that call would be particularly stronger against some of the bigger G10 crosses, particularly particularly the yen, but also the euro. Where I think it's possible that the dollar could strengthen is against some of these emerging market currencies, particularly in Asia, Northeast Asia, where we think the economies are very exposed if we do get a ramp up of trade protectionism.
Great. Well, that's fascinating. Thank you for what has been a whirlwind tour of your research on this very important topic of protectionism. To our listeners, if this call has whet your appetite, then do take a look at the full report, The Impact of US Trade Protectionism Centering on China. It was published on the 23rd of March. And with that, it just falls on me to say thank you, Rob, for your time. We hope our listeners have enjoyed this podcast. There's plenty more where this came from on subjects varying from BOJ monetary policy to the US economic outlook to Brexit, Article 50 and the French elections. The next one will be in a week's time, so please do tune in then. Thank you all for listening and have a good week.